Picture this. You are 13 years old, crossing the threshold of St. Benedict's Monastery in the year 1347. The massive wooden doors close behind you with a sound that echoes through stone corridors. Your parents believe they're giving you the gift of education and salvation. The abbot greets you with kind words about serving God and finding your purpose in this sacred place. The older monks smile warmly as they explain the holy rituals you'll learn during your time here. You think they mean prayers and scripture study. You think they mean copying religious texts and tending monastery gardens. You think you're entering a sanctuary of spiritual purity. You're wrong. What happens behind these consecrated walls after the evening bells ring would shock even the most corrupt medieval courts. What you're about to experience isn't random misconduct by individual predators. It's systematic. It's institutional. It's been refined over generations of religious authority. Tonight, we expose 6 ritualized practices that turned houses of God into chambers of calculated exploitation. Medieval monasteries operated as completely closed institutions with absolute authority over their inhabitants. Parents delivered their sons to these religious communities, believing they were providing the best possible education and spiritual formation. What they didn't realize was that this isolation created perfect conditions for systematic abuse that could operate without detection or accountability. These weren't random acts of individual corruption. Medieval monasteries had developed elaborate systems that transformed religious authority into tools of exploitation. They created hierarchies of abuse disguised as spiritual mentorship. They built structures that isolated victims and silenced witnesses. They corrupted sacred rituals into instruments of predation. What you're about to discover reveals how thousands of boys across medieval Europe suffered these fates in institutions that claimed to be refuges from worldly corruption. The very vows of celibacy that were supposed to purify souls instead created pressures that exploded into systematic abuse of the most vulnerable. The practices we'll examine tonight weren't accidents or aberrations. They were carefully constructed systems that used religious language and spiritual authority to justify horrific exploitation. And as we'll see, the patterns established in these medieval institutions continue to echo in modern religious scandals. The first lesson you learn as a young novice is that not all confession is equal. When Brother Thomas leads you to his private chamber for what he calls special confession, you assume this is standard procedure for new arrivals. After all, you've heard that young souls require more intensive spiritual guidance than mature monks. The room is small and candlelit, with heavy wooden doors that close with a distinctive click. Brother Thomas explains that traditional public confessionals cannot provide the intimate spiritual direction that young novices require. He sits close beside you instead of behind the protective screen, saying this closeness is necessary for proper soul formation. His questions start normally enough. Have you experienced impure thoughts? Have you struggled with bodily temptations? These seem like reasonable inquiries about spiritual purity. But gradually, his questions become more specific, more detailed, more invasive. He asks you to describe these experiences in exact detail, claiming this precision is necessary for understanding the precise nature of your spiritual struggles. You notice his breathing grows heavier as you speak. His hand rests first on your shoulder, then your knee, then moves to places that make you uncomfortable. But Brother Thomas explains that this is all part of the confession process. He says physical examination is necessary to understand the spiritual corruption that affects the flesh. Here's what makes this practice truly horrific. These sessions weren't secret activities hidden from monastery leadership. They were documented in official records as legitimate spiritual practice. Abbots knew about them, encouraged them, and defended them as necessary for the proper formation of young religious minds. When parents questioned why their sons returned from monastery visits, changed, withdrawn, and reluctant to speak about their experiences, they were told this was the natural result of deep spiritual transformation. The practice had elaborate theological justification rooted in corrupted interpretations of spiritual direction. Medieval religious texts spoke legitimately about the necessity for experienced spiritual fathers to guide young souls through the dangers of adolescent temptation. These authentic concepts were twisted into systematic exploitation hidden behind walls of religious authority and parental trust. Different monasteries developed their own refinements of the practice. Some focused on elaborate psychological manipulation that convinced boys they were specially chosen for divine purposes that others couldn't understand. Others used fear-based approaches that threatened eternal punishment for resistance or disclosure. All of them created dependency relationships where victims became psychologically bonded to their abusers through trauma and isolation. The frequency and intensity escalated over time. What began as weekly sessions became nightly visits. What started as inappropriate questioning became physical violation. What was initially presented as temporary spiritual medicine became permanent psychological destruction. Boys learned that resistance led to punishment and isolation, while compliance brought small privileges that felt enormous in their restricted world. But special confession was just the beginning of monastic exploitation. What they called spiritual marriage was far more systematic and devastating. The concept of spiritual marriage between older and younger monks had legitimate historical roots in early Christian mentorship traditions. But medieval monasteries corrupted this practice into organized exploitation disguised as religious formation. When Brother Francis explains that he will be your spiritual husband, guiding you through sacred mysteries that ordinary people cannot comprehend, you don't understand the implications. The ceremony itself resembles authentic religious ritual, conducted in the monastery chapel after evening prayers with candles and incense, creating an atmosphere of sacred solemnity. Brother Francis places a ring on your finger while reciting prayers about spiritual union and divine love. Other monks witness the ceremony with serious expressions, lending institutional legitimacy to what is actually ritual preparation for systematic abuse. The presence of multiple religious authorities makes questioning the practice seem like spiritual rebellion rather than legitimate self-protection. Your new spiritual husband explains that this relationship requires complete obedience and trust. Just as earthly wives submit to their husbands in all matters, spiritual wives must submit to their spiritual husbands in all things. This submission includes physical intimacy that mirrors earthly marriage, but serves what he claims are higher spiritual purposes. You're told this is secret knowledge, advanced spiritual practice that only the most mature souls can understand. The secrecy makes you feel specially chosen, while simultaneously isolating you from potential sources of help or alternative perspectives. But the spiritual marriage system created networks of exploitation throughout entire monastery communities. Older monks, who had themselves been spiritual wives as novices, graduated to become spiritual husbands of new arrivals. This created cycles of abuse, where victims became perpetrators, ensuring the system's continuation across generations. The trauma bond between spiritual spouses made reporting nearly impossible because it would implicate the victim in the very practices they were attempting to expose. Living arrangements reinforced the exploitation. Spiritual wives were moved to cells adjacent to their spiritual husbands, providing easy access for nighttime visits while creating isolation from potential allies among other novices. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and deliberate. Spiritual husbands would alternate between kindness and cruelty, creating emotional dependency that made psychological escape nearly impossible. They presented the abuse as spiritual privilege, convincing boys that their suffering was actually a form of mystical union with the divine that ordinary people couldn't achieve. Different religious orders developed their own variations of spiritual marriage practices. Benedictine monasteries often emphasized the teacher-student dynamic, presenting abuse as educational necessity. Franciscan communities sometimes used poverty vows to create additional dependencies, where spiritual wives relied entirely on their spiritual husbands for basic needs like food and clothing. The institutional protection was absolute. When complaints arose, abbots would transfer spiritual couples to different monasteries rather than investigate the allegations. This created networks of abusive monks who moved between institutions, bringing their practices with them while avoiding accountability for their actions.
If this already feels darker than anything you learned in history class, we're just getting started. These practices were documented, systematic, and protected by institutional authority for centuries. Hit the subscribe button for more buried truths they tried to erase. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single response. Now, back to the horrifying reality of medieval monastic life. The night office was legitimate religious practice requiring monks to wake for midnight prayers and scripture reading. But these late-night gatherings became opportunities for systematic exploitation that operated under cover of religious observance. When Brother Paul wakes you for special night office duties, you assume this means you're being honored with additional religious responsibilities. The legitimate night office involves the entire monastic community gathering in the chapel for communal prayer. But the special night office sessions involve only selected novices taken to private chambers for what is described as advanced spiritual formation. These sessions allegedly prepare young monks for eventual leadership roles through intensive religious instruction that requires privacy and discretion. Brother Paul leads you through darkened monastery corridors to chambers you've never seen before. He explains that the night hours are particularly sacred because they mirror Christ's own late-night prayers and suffering. Young novices who participate in these special observances receive spiritual benefits that ordinary religious practice cannot provide. You feel privileged to be chosen for such advanced religious education. The chamber is arranged like a private chapel, with religious artwork, candles, and a small altar that lends authenticity to the religious claims. Brother Paul begins with legitimate prayers and scripture readings that seem to validate the religious nature of the gathering. But gradually, the content becomes more personal and invasive. The prayers focus on physical purity and spiritual submission in ways that make you increasingly uncomfortable.
The night office sessions include multiple older monks who take turns providing spiritual instruction to the selected novices. This instruction involves physical examination and inappropriate conduct justified as necessary for understanding spiritual purity. The boys are told that their bodies are temples that require inspection and purification by experienced spiritual authorities. The group nature of these sessions creates additional psychological pressure. Boys witness other novices submitting to the same treatment, normalizing the misconduct, and making resistance seem both futile and spiritually rebellious. The presence of multiple authority figures creates overwhelming pressure to comply with whatever is demanded. Different monasteries developed distinctive night office practices that served their particular preferences for exploitation. Some emphasized confession-style sessions where boys were required to describe their most intimate thoughts and experiences in explicit detail. Others focused on physical purification rituals that provided cover for extensive misconduct. The timing of these sessions was carefully calculated to maximize vulnerability and minimize detection. The late hour meant that boys were isolated from any potential witnesses or sources of help. The religious framing made questioning the practices seem like spiritual rebellion rather than legitimate concern for safety. Record-keeping for night office sessions was deliberately obscure, using religious language that provided plausible cover for the actual activities. References to spiritual formation, purification rituals, and advanced religious instruction concealed systematic exploitation that operated with institutional knowledge and protection. The psychological impact was devastating and long-lasting. Boys learned to associate religious observance with violation and betrayal. They developed complex trauma responses that made normal spiritual practice difficult or impossible throughout their lives.
The holy kiss was legitimate Christian tradition dating back to early church practices. Monks greeted each other with ceremonial kisses as expressions of Christian brotherhood and spiritual unity. But this tradition became distorted into systematic preparation that readied boys for more serious boundary violations, while maintaining the appearance of normal religious observance. Brother David explains that the holy kiss tradition requires special instruction for young novices because improper practice can lead to spiritual confusion or inappropriate attachments. These private lessons in proper greeting rituals seem like reasonable religious education. You don't realize that you're being systematically prepared through gradual boundary violations disguised as religious instruction. The lessons begin with demonstrations of different types of holy kisses, appropriate for various religious occasions. Brother David shows you the proper placement for greeting kisses, blessing kisses, and ceremonial kisses used during religious festivals. The instruction seems educational, and the physical contact feels appropriate within the religious context. But gradually, the demonstrations become more progressively personal and private. The duration of the kisses increases, the placement becomes more intimate, the frequency of practice sessions multiplies. What began as educational instruction transforms into systematic boundary violation that prepares you for more serious inappropriate behavior while maintaining plausible religious justification. The distorted holy kiss practice creates emotional bonds between authority figures and younger novices that complicate reporting and resistance. Boys who have been systematically influenced through misused religious affection often feel responsible for the inappropriate behavior or confused about whether it actually constitutes wrongdoing. The practice serves as a screening mechanism for identifying the most vulnerable targets. Boys who resist or question the increasingly inappropriate holy kiss instruction are typically abandoned for easier targets. Those who comply or seem to enjoy the attention receive escalated questionable conduct through the other systematic practices operating within the monastery. Different religious orders developed their own variations of this distorted tradition. Some emphasized the spiritual significance of the practice to create additional psychological pressure for compliance. Others used feast day celebrations as opportunities for more intensive influence sessions, disguised as holiday preparations. The documentation shows that abbots and senior monks were aware of the misused holy kiss practices, but chose to reframe them as minor disciplinary issues rather than systematic emotional manipulation. This institutional protection allowed the practices to continue while providing cover for more serious boundary violations that followed. The distorted holy kiss practice was particularly insidious because it weaponized legitimate religious affection. Boys learned to distrust expressions of spiritual care and brotherhood, creating psychological damage that extended far beyond the immediate physical inappropriate behavior.
Medieval monasteries practiced flagellation as legitimate religious discipline, but these ceremonies became opportunities for boundary violations that shocked even contemporary observers who discovered what was actually happening in private chambers. When Brother Michael announces that your spiritual formation requires participation in special penitential rites, you assume this means additional prayers or fasting. You don't realize you're being inducted into ritualized, inappropriate conduct disguised as religious observance. Public flagellation ceremonies held during Lent and other penitential seasons were legitimate religious practice. Monks would gather in the chapel to engage in self-discipline as acts of spiritual purification and identification with Christ's suffering. But the private flagellation sessions conducted for individual spiritual formation served very different purposes. Brother Michael leads you to a private chamber prepared specifically for these rituals. The walls are decorated with religious artwork depicting martyrdom and suffering, creating an atmosphere where pain becomes associated with spiritual advancement. He explains that young novices require more intensive penitential discipline than mature monks because their spiritual flesh is more prone to weakness. The ceremony begins with prayers and scripture readings about the necessity of suffering for spiritual purification. You're instructed to remove your clothing for proper application of the discipline. Brother Michael examines your body with what he claims is clinical attention, explaining that different areas correspond to different spiritual weaknesses that require targeted correction. But here's where it becomes clear this isn't legitimate religious practice. The flagellation quickly becomes an opportunity for inappropriate touching disguised as spiritual ministry. Brother Michael's hands linger on your body far longer than necessary. The examination becomes exploration. The spiritual discipline becomes physical boundary violation, all while maintaining the pretense of religious ritual. The sessions escalate in intensity and intimacy over time. What begins as brief ceremonial flagellation becomes extended periods of inappropriate conduct justified through distorted religious language. Boys learn that resistance is spiritual rebellion, while compliance is holy obedience. The pain becomes associated with divine approval, creating psychological dependence that makes escape nearly impossible. Different orders developed distinctive flagellation practices that served as cover for various forms of questionable behavior. Some emphasized group ceremonies where multiple novices were subjected to inappropriate treatment simultaneously under the guise of communal spiritual discipline. Others focused on individual sessions that allowed for more intensive and private boundary violations of vulnerable boys. The documentation of these practices in monastery records reveals their systematic nature. Schedules were maintained for individual flagellation sessions. Records were kept of which novices required more intensive spiritual discipline. The inappropriate conduct was organized and institutionalized rather than random or opportunistic. The psychological manipulation was particularly sophisticated during flagellation sessions.
Boys were taught that physical suffering served spiritual purposes and that questioning the necessity or appropriateness of the discipline constituted sin. They learned that their bodies belonged to God and that religious authorities acted as divine representatives who could demand any form of compliance.
Cell visitations were legitimate monastic practice where senior monks inspected junior monks' living quarters to ensure compliance with religious rules and proper spiritual development. But these inspections became opportunities for systematic exploitation that operated with complete institutional protection and plausible religious justification. Brother Martin explains that your cell requires special attention because new novices often struggle with proper religious discipline in their private quarters. These additional inspections will ensure your spiritual development proceeds correctly and help identify any areas where additional guidance might be needed. You feel grateful for such individualized attention to your religious formation. The initial inspections seem legitimate and educational. Brother Martin examines your religious books, prayer materials, and personal belongings to ensure compliance with monastic rules. He provides guidance about proper arrangement of religious items and explains the spiritual significance of maintaining organized living space. The attention feels like genuine mentorship. But gradually, the inspections become more invasive and personal. Brother Martin begins examining your clothing and personal effects more thoroughly. He starts requesting that you demonstrate proper prayer positions and religious observances while he watches closely. The educational nature of the visits transforms into systematic boundary violation. The cell visitation system operates on systematic schedules that provide regular access to victims while maintaining plausible religious justification. Boys learn that resistance to the inspections or questioning their necessity constitutes spiritual rebellion that will result in punishment and isolation from the monastic community. The privacy of individual cells provides perfect cover for exploitation that leaves no witnesses and creates no evidence. Boys who report inappropriate conduct during cell visitations are typically accused of spiritual delusion or malicious lying designed to damage the reputation of dedicated religious authorities. Different monasteries developed distinctive cell visitation practices that served their particular preferences for exploitation. Some emphasized examination of physical cleanliness and personal hygiene as justification for inappropriate touching. Others focused on spiritual counseling sessions that provided cover for psychological manipulation and emotional exploitation. The institutional documentation of cell visitation practices reveals their systematic nature while concealing their actual purpose. Schedules are maintained for regular inspections. Records are kept of which novices require additional attention. The exploitation is organized and institutionalized rather than random or opportunistic. Multiple perpetrators often coordinate their cell visitation activities to share access to particular victims while providing mutual protection from accusations of misconduct. This creates networks of abusive monks who support each other's activities while ensuring that no single individual faces isolated accusations of misconduct. The cell visitation system creates additional psychological pressure through its integration with other monastic disciplinary practices. Boys who resist the inspections face consequences in other areas of monastic life, including food restrictions, work assignments, and exclusion from religious activities that make monastery life bearable.
Understanding individual practices doesn't capture the full scope of monastic exploitation. What made these institutions truly dangerous was how they systematically protected perpetrators while silencing victims through carefully constructed religious and social mechanisms. Medieval monasteries operated as closed communities with their own legal systems that were largely independent of secular authority.
When allegations arose, they were handled through internal religious processes that prioritized protecting institutional reputation over victim safety or perpetrator accountability. The religious framework provided multiple mechanisms for dismissing or reframing abuse allegations. Victims who reported exploitation were often accused of spiritual delusion, malicious lying, or demonic influence that made their testimony unreliable. The same religious authority that enabled the abuse also controlled the mechanisms for reporting and investigating it. Economic dependencies created additional barriers to reporting and resistance. Boys whose families had paid substantial fees for monastery admission faced financial ruin if they were expelled for making accusations against religious authorities. Families who depended on monastery charity or employment faced retaliation if their children reported abuse. The educational monopoly that monasteries held in medieval society made resistance particularly difficult. Boys who fled monastery schools often had no alternative educational opportunities, condemning them to lives of illiteracy and poverty. This created powerful incentives to endure abuse rather than sacrifice future prospects through resistance. The psychological conditioning was sophisticated and deliberate. Boys were taught that suffering served spiritual purposes and that questioning religious authority constituted sin. They learned that their bodies belonged to God and that religious authorities acted as divine representatives who could demand any form of submission or sacrifice. The theological justifications were elaborate and carefully constructed to provide religious cover for systematic exploitation. Corrupted interpretations of spiritual obedience, physical purification, and religious submission created frameworks that made abuse seem like legitimate religious practice rather than criminal exploitation. The isolation of monastic communities from external oversight created perfect conditions for systematic abuse that could operate without detection or accountability. Boys were cut off from family support systems and surrounded by religious authorities who controlled every aspect of their daily lives. The international nature of medieval monasticism created networks for transferring abusive monks between institutions when local situations became difficult. This prevented accountability while ensuring that systematic exploitation could continue in new locations with fresh victims. Transfer policies were deliberately designed to protect institutional reputation rather than prevent future abuse. When complaints arose, the typical response was to quietly move problematic monks to different monasteries rather than investigate allegations or remove dangerous individuals from positions of authority over vulnerable populations.
These medieval practices feel urgently relevant as we continue to grapple with institutional abuse and the corruption of religious authority in contemporary society. The same patterns of exploitation, silencing, and institutional protection continue to operate in various forms throughout modern religious and educational institutions. The Boston Globe investigations that began in 2002 revealed systematic abuse within the Catholic Church that used identical patterns to those established in medieval monasteries. Priests were transferred between parishes when allegations arose. Internal investigations prioritized institutional protection over victim safety. Religious authority was used to silence victims and prevent reporting. Recent reports from Germany, France, and other countries have documented thousands of cases of clerical abuse that operated with institutional knowledge and protection.
The mechanisms of exploitation, isolation, and silencing refined in medieval monasteries continue to operate in modern religious institutions. The Vatican's responses to contemporary abuse scandals have followed patterns established centuries ago. Initial denial, followed by claims of isolated incidents, followed by promises of internal reform that preserve existing power structures while appearing to address the problems. Transfer policies that move abusive clergy between jurisdictions without warning receiving communities continue to create networks of exploitation that span multiple countries and decades. The same institutional protection mechanisms that enabled medieval monastic abuse continued to shield modern perpetrators from accountability. The psychological techniques used to groom and silence victims in medieval monasteries appear in contemporary abuse cases with remarkable consistency. Religious authority is used to convince victims that abuse serves spiritual purposes. Isolation from external support systems makes reporting difficult or impossible. Economic dependencies that made resistance difficult in medieval times continue to operate in modern religious communities. Families who depend on religious institutions for education, employment, or social support face similar pressures to remain silent about abuse. The theological justifications that provided cover for medieval abuse have evolved, but retain their essential character. Contemporary religious authorities continue to use concepts of obedience, submission, and spiritual authority to justify inappropriate conduct and silence victims. International networks of religious institutions continue to facilitate the transfer of problematic clergy and the concealment of abuse allegations. The global nature of modern religious organizations creates even more opportunities for evading accountability than existed in medieval times. Legal reforms and increased oversight have made some progress in addressing institutional abuse, but the fundamental power dynamics that enabled medieval monastic exploitation continue to operate in modified forms throughout contemporary religious institutions.
Today, as we reflect on these horrifying practices that operated for centuries under the protection of religious authority, we must confront uncomfortable truths about the corruption of institutional power. These weren't isolated incidents by rogue individuals. They were systematic practices protected by carefully constructed religious, legal, and social mechanisms. The boys who suffered in medieval monasteries were not random victims of unfortunate circumstances. They were systematically targeted, groomed, and exploited by institutions that claimed to represent the highest moral authority. Their suffering was not accidental. It was the predictable result of unchecked power operating without external accountability. Understanding this history isn't about attacking religious faith or undermining legitimate spiritual practice. It's about recognizing how institutional power can corrupt even the most sacred traditions when it operates without transparency, accountability, or external oversight. The patterns established in medieval monasteries continue to echo in contemporary scandals because the fundamental dynamics of institutional abuse remain unchanged. Closed communities, unchecked authority, and systematic silencing of victims create conditions where exploitation can flourish, regardless of the institution's stated mission or values. The victims of medieval monastic abuse deserve to have their stories told and their suffering acknowledged. They were children who trusted religious authorities to guide and protect them. Instead, they encountered systematic exploitation disguised as spiritual formation.
Their voices, silenced for centuries by institutional power, speak to us across time with urgent warnings about the corruption that inevitably follows when authority operates without accountability. Only by confronting this dark history can we hope to prevent its repetition in contemporary institutions. The forgotten victims of medieval monasteries finally deserve justice in the form of historical memory and honest acknowledgement of their suffering. Their experiences illuminate the dangers that emerge when religious authority becomes divorced from genuine spiritual purpose. As we continue to uncover more buried truths about institutional abuse throughout history, we honor these victims by refusing to let their stories remain hidden. Subscribe for more investigations into the dark chapters they tried to erase, because understanding the past is essential for protecting the vulnerable in our own time. The next video reveals another shocking historical scandal that powerful institutions tried to bury forever. Click now to continue our journey through the hidden darkness of human history, because only by confronting these truths can we ensure they never happen again. These voices from the past deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.